In the summer of 1307, King Edward I, King of England, headed to Scotland to meet in conflict the armies of Robert the Bruce. During the journey north, he developed dysentery. On the night of the 6th of July 1307, he was encamped at Burr-on-the-Sands in Cumberland. But when his servants came to tend him on the morning of the 7th of July 1307, he died in their arms. Edward's body was embalmed, as was normal practice for English kings, eviscerated and wrapped in waxed cloth, and then it was brought south, resting temporarily at Waltham Abbey before being buried on the 27th of October in Westminster Abbey. The funeral was taken by the king's friend and confidant, Bishop Anthony Beck. Beck was Bishop of Durham from 1283 and was also the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem from 1306. He was one of Edward's most trusted and loyal servants, his relationship with the king going as far back as 1270, when aged 25 he accompanied Edward, then the Prince and Heir Apparent, on crusade. Edward was buried in the chapel of St Edward the Confessor behind the high altar of Westminster Abbey, in the arch next on the west to where his father Henry III, who had constructed the chapel, was buried. And unlike his father's tomb, which is tall, fine and surmounted by an effigy and made of wonderful cosmati work, Edward's tomb is relatively plain and simple in construction. It is simply made of 5 slabs of Purbeck marble. It is unadorned except for an inscription which reads Edwardus primus Scotorum malleus hic est millesimus trecentissimus octavus pactum server. Here is Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, 1308. Keep the pact. This mysterious inscription, what precisely does it mean, keep the pact, is on the north side of the tomb, facing out towards the ambulatory, the walkway around the Confessor's Chapel, and it was intended to be seen. It is assumed to be later than the date, given it gets the date of the king's death wrong, 1308 rather than the correct 1307. The usual assumption is that it was added in the middle of the 16th century by Abbot John Feckenham, the abbot of the monastic community that was restored to Westminster in the reign of Mary I. And stylistically, it is painted in Roman letters, which would make sense for a 16th century date. Others have argued that it's original. I can't see that. The title Hammer of the Scots is not one that Edward was ever given in life, and seems to derive from this inscription. In life, he was generally known as Edward Longshanks, which, as we will see later, was a title that he well deserved. There is visual and documentary evidence that the tomb was originally not quite so simple as it is now. At medieval coronations, the tomb appears to have been covered with a pall made of cloth of gold. An engraving by James Cole, published in Dart's West Monasterium in 1701, a very detailed guide to the abbey, shows the tomb enclosed with a metal railing or grille, a row of upright posts topped with fleur-de-lis. The 2 outer posts seem to be topped with tiny little busts of kings. By the time that Gough wrote his great work, Sepulchral Monuments, only one of these busts then remained. But Gough concluded that the busts were intended to be portraits of the king. It isn't clear when these railings disappeared. They were still in place in 1774. There was also at one point a timber tester, or a canopy of honour, directly over the tomb, and this is shown in Gaywood's engraving of 1677 in Sandford's Genealogical History of the Kings of England. This tester may well have been 15th century and painted, like the surviving tester, over the tomb of Edward's father Henry III. The tester was torn down and destroyed in 1764 at the funeral of the Whig politician and briefly Prime Minister William Pulteney, 1st Earl of Bath, who is buried in the Islip Chapel, which is on the other side of the North Ambulatory from Edward's tomb. There was also situated beside the tomb what Dart refers to in West Monasterium as a table, a tablet, a board with both a Latin inscription and an English translation beside it. Weaver also sees the board in 1631, and he publishes the text of it in his volume Ancient Funeral Monuments. By the time Dart gets to it, it is very worn, and he relies on Weaver's transcript. This table seems to have been put up in lieu of a proper epitaph on the tomb, and its primary role was to extol, in very flowery language, the virtues of King Edward I and to praise his military achievements. In Arms a giant, fierce and fell, it reads, attempting famous facts, most prudent did subdue the proud by feat of martial acts. In Flanders fortune gave to him by lot right good success. In Wales he won the Scottish rout, with arms he did suppress. The inscription also painted the picture of Edward as a pious man. He now doth lie entombed here, which furthered each good thing. Now naught he is but dust and bones, which was a worthy king, the very Son of God, whom erst this king did love right dear, have given to him immortal bliss for his good living here. Whilst lived this king, by him all things were in most goodly plight. Fraud lay hid, great peace was kept, and honesty had might. I think the Scots and the Welsh might have had a thing or two to say about this particularly glowing assessment of King Edward I. It seems that measures were actually taken after Edward's death to ensure that his body was not allowed to simply fall into dust and bones, as this epitaph declared. The coffin of Edward was routinely opened in the Middle Ages, and his body underwent continual treatment. Dart records that during the reign of Richard II, the great-grandson of Edward, Richard ordered that the treasurer and chamberlains of the household were to renovate the wax around the body of Edward, as hath hereto before been accustomed. Similar orders were given by Edward III and also by King Henry IV. No other medieval kings' bodies, except those of saints, were so treated. Presumably the wax that needed renovating was in fact the cerecloth, the waxed cloth that was used as the principal agent of embalming in the Middle Ages. Now, there's been a long tradition, often these days assumed to be apocryphal, that Edward I wanted his heart taken to the Holy Land, and that his body was to be removed from the grave from time to time and taken with the English army into battle on every campaign against the Scots. Now, the removal of the heart to the Holy Land is quite believable. Such things were common practice. But the carting around of the corpse is perhaps less so. But perhaps this constant care for King Edward's corpse and the simplicity of the king's tomb, which is relatively easy to dismantle, was in order to prepare for the fulfilment of this wish if it ever needed to be enacted. We will never know, but what we do know is that Edward's body does not appear to leave the tomb once it is placed within it. So that's all the contextual stuff. Now for the gory bit. In 1770, Daines Barrington, a lawyer and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, began a campaign to persuade the Dean and Chapter of Westminster to allow the tomb of King Edward I to be opened, primarily to work out what was meant by all those references to the wax renovation of his corpse mentioned in medieval documentary sources. 4 years after the initial request, the Dean and Chapter agreed, and King Edward I's tomb was opened on the 2nd of May 1774. An account of the opening was given to the Society of Antiquaries by Sir Joseph Ayloff, and William Blake, the poet-painter, was on hand to record the content. His drawings of Edward's tomb, the interior of Edward's tomb and his coffin, are now in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries of London. It was found, when it was removed, that the lid of the tomb was not fixed to the rest of the monument and was simply resting on the top, presumably to allow for the frequent access required to the king's body for the renovations. Inside the tomb chest was found a stone coffin laying on a fine layer of rubble, a coffin made of fine, smooth Purbeck marble that was 6 foot 7 inches long. It had a 3-inch thick lid, and the outside of the coffin and the lid were covered in a layer of yellow varnish, which it has been suggested may be the remains of gold leaf. Opening the coffin was an extraordinary moment for Barrington and Ayloff. The first thing they saw was that the corpse of the king had been wrapped up in a square mantle of strong coarse linen, which had been waxed on the underside, the side that touched the king's body. This cloth ran under the king's body and overlapped the front, but didn't completely envelop him. In this drawing by William Blake, you can see that the top of the king's head, with a crown upon it, is visible sticking up above this cloth. Presumably, this is the waxed cloth that was replaced so often. Now, when this waxed cloth was pulled back, the king's body was revealed. He had a cloth of red silk over his face, which had more or less perished. As we see in this drawing by Blake, the king's corpse was discovered richly habited, adorned with ensigns of royalty, and almost entire. His body had little decomposed, but was simply dry brown, chocolate-coloured, Ayloff says, and slightly shrunken. His body was measured, and he was found to be 6 foot 2 inches in height, which no doubt gave rise to his name Longshanks. His body, except for his lower arms and his hands, had been wrapped tightly in an inner covering of waxed cloth. But over this, Edward had been dressed in a lavish set of royal robes. Over the cerecloth wrapping, he was dressed in a tunic of red silk damask, and over this was placed a priestly stole. This was crossed over the chest, as a medieval priest would have worn it. This stole, worked in gold embroidery, was decorated with what the antiquaries thought were glass or paste stones, and with hundreds of tiny little beads like pearls. Over all of this, the king was wearing a mantle of crimson satin, clasped at the side with a brooch of gilt metal, which was also studded with false stones. Then from the waist down, a piece of cloth of gold covered the entirety of the king's lower body. Now I find this absolutely fascinating. Edward is dressed in precisely the robes that British sovereigns wear when they are crowned today, although the present garments, of course, are modern. The lower layer that Edward is wearing, the tunic, is called a supertunica. Over this, our sovereigns still wear a priestly stole, indicating that the sovereign has a quasi-sacerdotal role. And then over that is worn a royal mantle. Now, in the coffin, there was also funeral regalia made of gilt copper. On King Edward's head was a narrow band or circlet of gilt copper decorated with trefoils. In his right hand was a 2.5-foot sceptre topped with a cross, and in his left hand a 5-foot rod surmounted with a dove decorated with green enamel. Still to this day, our sovereigns at their coronations are invested with a shorter sceptre with a cross and a longer rod with a dove. These are 17th century copies of objects from the medieval coronation regalia kept in Westminster Abbey, the regalia associated with St Edward the Confessor, and were probably part of the Confessor's grave goods. Edward I seems to have been the first English king to be invested with the Confessor's regalia after his father Henry III had retrieved them all from the Confessor's coffin. And it seems likely that Edward's mortuary sceptre and rod replicate the original St Edward's regalia and therefore give us a sense of their form. King Edward I, wrapped and re-wrapped every few years, was buried in this rather austere tomb chest in the extraordinary royal finery he would have worn at his coronation. Nothing was removed from his coffin in 1774, and he still rests within his tomb, so adorned. Thanks very much for watching. If you like what you see on this channel, please subscribe and share. You can help support my channel at PayPal and the website Buy Me a Coffee. Details are below in the description box and links are on the homepage.